Hello, everyone, and welcome to Integration Down Under February 2022. I having trouble saying that. I just haven't got used to 2022 yet. But it's been such a long time thinking about it. We're almost on that 2-year go now for since we've had in-person events. I was remembering, I think I saw most of you guys in Sydney at the end of February, I think in 2020. There was a thing that they had up there that I remember going to, but it's been almost 2 full years. So I can't wait to. I enjoyed the being able to walk in Melbourne into the grocery store without a mask on today for the first time in forever. Okay, so let's go on with the slides. So we've got our organizers, Martin, Dan, Mick, Wagner, and myself. Mick's taken over for Renee in Sydney. Most of us have known Mick for absolute ever. It's got to be back in the early BizTalk days.
Oh, it does, doesn't it?
That's how I met Mick. He introduced me to BizTalk.
You've got a lot to answer for, Mick.
The good, the bad, and the ugly, right?
I got some therapy bills for you, Mick.
So, and tonight Mick is going to be presenting for us and talking about container apps. So I've been wanting to find out about container apps, so I had to go find somebody that could talk about container apps. So that was that part of my method to my madness. I figure if I want to hear about it, other people probably want to hear about it. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and switch over to Mick. And so add Mick's to the stream, get rid of mine. Oh, there we go. And then I'm going to go to just the, just the layout for the slides, unless you want to be on the screen the whole time, Mick.
No, that's fine, guys.
So there we go. Yeah. All over to you, Mick.
All right, beautiful. We're on. Okay. So, yeah, welcome. Thanks, guys. Just in case you can hear some background noise, that's my puppy, Nala, that's decided to come and play right at the opportune moment. So, look, I'm excited to talk and present. I'm sort of always on the lookout for new technologies, and container apps has really caught my attention for a lot of reasons. And I think, I think what we're doing these days is very much sort of, cloud-based solutions. And what's the best way for us to be able to develop those? During sort of my day-to-day life, I consult on various solutions. I'm currently working on a SaaS product that they're building a platform, and based in Azure, largely multi-region, and having all sorts of fun, shall I say, with this platform. Just because you're in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean everything is ticked off and it's 100% beautiful. There's still, you can still misuse a lot of the technologies in there, and obviously to the outset things don't add up too much. So what I'd like to do is to go through this new technology, container apps, and combine it potentially with some other existing toolkits and things, so that we can really get the most out of it. Let's see what I've got. Just got a couple of screens here, so just bear with me. There we go. So loosely, what I'd like to do is what are these container apps? Let's sort of get to know what they are, and then there's a great little toolkit called DAPR, if you're not familiar with it. And, it sort of adds tools and components and things that kind of make our life a little bit easier. And so, I'd like to then start to paint the picture of what potentially we're going to be looking at. And, we'll then jump in and have a look at a demo. So often when we're designing a solution, building a solution, or even, walking into a pre-made, already existing one, often it can be quite daunting as to, where do I start? And, what are some of the decisions that we need to make? What technology should we use? And what are the business needs? Because, invariably we sort of have this monolith. We might have a monolith and services. We might have some quite complex, these days, as you're looking at DevOps and the likes, and sort of, well, how is my code going to run? And over the years, I've seen, been privy to so many, well, it works on my machine. And I even printed out a certificate, and we'd give it to, the developer of the week that used that phrase too many times. So it was actually, quite funny. So, how do we go from working on my machine to enterprise scale? And that's really some of the things I'd like to, raise questions in your mind about what is it that we need. And I've just listed down some of the things here that, potentially we could be looking at around, well, the business just cares about features. And, what about all the rest of the stuff? Latency, availability, cost should be in there these days too. Integrity, how can we lift and shift, or how can we run it in multi-region? All of those sorts of things are quite important. And we can start to sort of dissect our functionality and feature set by simply, saying, is this critical? Is this, the API or the work or the call or the interaction, is that critical that needs to be done right here and now? Or can we push it to, some async process that near enough is good enough, or even, that can be done in the background and we don't really care if it takes 15 seconds, 15 minutes, or an hour. So these are some really important questions to ask up front when you're designing some of these data flows, these integrations, these, however you want to call them. They go by many different names these days. But, being able to sort of have that sort of clarity around, well, most of the things that we're talking about here are on the cold path, so to speak. So therefore, we don't need to do a lot of them. Now, have them as a high priority. So then there's some other things around, well, how do we manage our services and how do we deliver features faster? How do we deliver features faster? And these are always the common questions. I didn't really have an appreciation of, some of these, namely things like deliver features faster until I came into an organization that would deliver one new update a year. And the reason for that was that the dependencies, the framework, the application infrastructure was just far too unwieldy. Monolithic is a great word. And even though there's teams and even though there's services and the like, everything needed a coordinated effort, right from the data stores to APIs to schemas to front end. And it just wasn't feasible. It had reached breaking point. They'd gotten to critical mass, and away they went. So we had to go in there with some innovative ideas and break that up into microservices and the like, and different API layers that provided a bit of an air gap and some isolation and independence across the rest of the system. So when we're looking at, container apps, I really just called this Container Apps 101. I was on the early adopter program of container apps as it evolved out of Microsoft, and it still is evolving. And so, one of the things that's really quite fascinating is, well, whereabouts do we run this? You ask yourself, well, what is this piece of functionality, and where does it, where does it sort of sit and where does it play? Because as a modern day developer these days, we've got so many different technologies, if you like, at our disposal. And let's say, talking purely in the Azure world, we've got things like, functions and function apps, and where do I put those and how do I run them? And then, we've got a whole raft of other things around app services, which I haven't included on this slide. But let's say we'd like to head down the container path, and for good reason. So do we use container instances, ACI, for example? Do we use web apps for containers? Do we run them, let's say, inside a hosted VM or as part of an Azure batch service topology? Now, Azure Service Fabric is quite a meaty service, and that's another great place to run it as well. And then, we've also got our Kubernetes clusters and the like which make it ideal to run containers. So I've drawn a line across there that says, well, the amount of effort below that line is significant in terms of to get it up and running. So, often it can be overwhelming for developers. They've finished writing their code. If you think about, you've got 4 weeks to design a solution and build it. How much of that 4 weeks do you actually spend writing code? And how much of that time do you spend trying to build deployment vehicles, scripts, configuration files, YAML files, whatever it might be, so that your code runs, so you can actually run your code in whatever environment you would like. A client, for example, I would argue in a previous client, out of the 4 weeks, they would spend up to 3 weeks building, deployment pipelines, trying to get it into the right shape and fit with all sorts of, parameters and variables and other things that they had to go and source from target systems and the like. It was, so it was a nightmare. And really 1 week, clean week was free to build what you're building and develop, the solution. Now, that's well out of whack. That it really should be 3.5 weeks spent actually building business features and the like, and the rest, should just work. So in terms of this diagram, I've got container apps, which is sitting above, which basically means, there's a high level of functionality already provided under the hood. So you give you give this service a container, and essentially it will then look after running it for you. Now, that's also very similar to, let's say, AKS, where we've got a Kubernetes cluster, and the cluster also runs your container, or Service Fabric also runs your container in a cluster type environment. However, there's a fair bit of work to set that up, and there's a lot of other functionality and services and concepts that as a developer you need to know about above and beyond how does my code run. So what Microsoft have done is to come out with the container apps, Azure Container Apps, which essentially is a high-level service. I call it a high-level service, which you can give it your container and a couple of details about that, and then it will look after the rest for you. So there's a large amount of management code that's running in the background around your container and supporting it, so that you as a developer have a seamless experience. Does it do absolutely everything for you? No, it doesn't. But it does bridge the gap, if you like, between Kubernetes, between AKS and your container app. So the work or your container, and the work that's required to set up AKS, to route properly, to log properly, be resilient, etc., that's all managed for you. So under the covers, there is AKS. Now, if let's say you are a power development group and you know AKS inside out, then chances are you're probably still going to need AKS. But let's say for all the stuff that you don't need to be an Einstein in AKS for, container apps would be quite an interesting proposition because the learning curve is not steep. There's things that happen under the covers that you may or may not want to know about, but it's not absolutely required to know about. And you can be quite happily running your containers as and when you need to. So maybe it is quite an attractive service from that perspective. So in terms of some of the things that it does, and this is really if you like the money slide of what I'm doing and what I'm talking to you about. These are some classic sort of scenarios for container apps, and one of the things that obviously is quite prevalent within this service, container apps, we can come along and deploy our containers, deploy our code, and they're known as revisions. Our containers that we deploy are known as revisions. So we might just have one container that we deploy all day, every day. And we can also have a scenario where we're transitioning to the next revision or the next version. And we can then elect how we want to divide that HTTP traffic up between our different revisions. And, there's no limit sort of for 1 or 2 revisions, or you might have 5. And we can then split that up across, out of our, in essence, an HTTP load balancer, where do we want to route our traffic to? And so, you might be looking at sort of 50-50, you might be looking at 80-20, you might be looking at 20-20-20, whatever that might be. And that's purely just based on a load balance round robin type perspective. Now, one of the things underneath here is that we also have auto scale characteristics. So one of the things that we can configure with our revision or our container app is how do we want to employ scaling, and what does that scaling look like? So in a simple sense, we can have scaling based on the number of concurrent HTTP requests that are coming in. Or, when I say HTTP, it could be HTTPS and the like. So, how busy is this particular, maybe it's an API that we've containerized and we've thrown into a container and then deployed to container apps. So once our API gets quite busy, we'd like to scale up to X number of instances. Now, and that's all possible by setting up these auto scale rules. Now, what is it? How is this different to other auto scaling kind of, or metrics-based scaling services that we have? And that is that we can actually, if you want to, we can actually scale this down to 0. So we could say that, when there's no traffic, scale it down to 0. So we could have a service that runs, a container app that runs that has a 0 instance as the minimum instance. And that becomes quite interesting because then we're only paying for what we use. So rather than, sometimes if you're using app services, for example, there's a set fee or a set amount. We can have it on consumption based, and this is another one of those those paradigms, if you like. So quite handy. Now the next piece is it could be a container that just runs, or a container app that runs, doing some background processing, doing, let's say, image transformations, doing transactional upkeep. Maybe you've got a payment gateway that you need to go away to in the background each night and reconcile what's happened with your accounts and the payment gateway. there's a whole raft of different things. And you could scale by, for example, CPU load. There's other criteria, memory load as well. We could also have things like event-driven part of queues, so that and they don't have to be necessarily Azure-based queues. They could be Kafka queues and the like. This one of the things where in this piece of technology, Microsoft have really recognized the open source and a variety of different other platforms and triggers, if you like, scale triggers that you might want to incorporate. So, I could have a queue, and based on the number of messages on a queue, then, would determine the level of scaling that I'd like to scale my consumers. And then once we've processed those messages, we can then, scale back down to 0, for example, while we're waiting for new messages to come in. So these are some of the benefits that this service gives to us, above and beyond, hey, I've got a container, can you please run it for me? And so I really quite like some of this stuff. And then we've got also microservices and the like. And the part that is I want to draw your attention to here is we can build or trigger our container app scaling based on CADA triggers as well. So your Kubernetes event-driven architecture, that wherever that may be, could be on premises, could be another cloud provider, doesn't have to be or lock, stock and barrel inside Azure. So that's quite a fascinating piece of the puzzle as well. That we can scale these up and down. And for example, when you're working on projects that are consuming $130,000 on their monthly cloud spend, there's a lot of this becomes quite a big piece of work to go and investigate. How can we trim this down? How can we reduce costs? How can we get rid of things running that don't need to be running? So it's quite if you've ever been in that scenario, it's quite an interesting exercise. So let's have a look now at the setup of our container apps. So in terms of a container app, and I'll go from sort of the top down. Now, I'd say without Kubernetes here, so it's kind of like microservices without Kubernetes. We really have Kubernetes under the covers. We just don't necessarily see it in our face or need to be exposed to it as such. So the first grouping, if you like, or logical entity we see is our environment, our container apps environment, which is purely a logical group, and there's of which we run our container apps inside. Now, the environment provides some details for us around things like, what might be our public IP address. We also have things like a name that gets assigned to that environment. And you can see that over on the left-hand side here, which is, HTTP. Now, front is the name of my container app. And then the rest has been added by Microsoft, as part of the container apps world. So I get HTTPS. So, as I deploy and set this environment up, I get a certificate that's generated for me, which as part of my configuration routes through to a container app that I'm, that we're interested in. That could be termed the front door, if you like, of this container apps environment. So I also get things like logging and other things at the environment level. So once I have that, then I've got my container apps that I can deploy within this environment. So on its own, without any container apps, as you've probably figured out, the container environment doesn't really do anything, doesn't answer. The plumbing is there, but nothing is able to run any of this information. Now, I then go and deploy one container app, let's say, and we deploy it. And what we deploy into is the entity it's known as a revision. So in the world of container apps, we have a revision which has our particular container version inside it. Now I've drawn this up so that it's including DAPR, the distributed application program runtime. We don't need it. So I can use this world without DAPR quite easily. But however, it does give me best practices and it gives me a lot of benefits. So in this sense here, where I'd like to talk to some other piece of functionality. So for example, I might have, a comprehensive, complex set of APIs on my front container, on this first piece of functionality, which I've containerized and I've put it into a container and deployed it into container apps. And I suppose I'm just going to sort of pause for a moment and just do some context setting. What I'm looking at, what I find anyway that sort of resonates the best with me is that we've got a large API and maybe it's sitting behind APIM and it's built in a variety of different ways, maybe different languages or whatever. We've got, a back end or a front end API. We've got, a core API, whatever that might be. Excuse me. So we've run that API for quite some time, and it's not performing to the best that we'd like it to. What we'd like to do is to somehow make it more optimal. So when we start to have large APIs, things like startup time, shutdown time, redeployments, updates, upgrades, everything starts to become bigger, starts to become more, and to manage it becomes more, to build it becomes longer, to keep it in a repository, to do pushes, to do pulls, to start it up, to have, let's say, feature environments and the like around it that support it start to become more. So what we've noticed is, for example, that one of the controllers, let's say, or one of the operation sets inside our API is getting used a lot more than others. So maybe it's a payment, maybe it's orders, placing orders, getting orders, maybe it's inventory, whatever that might be, some sort of piece of functionality, modular, that we've made, that we've put behind, in a controller, for example, and it's just evolved and grown over time. So somehow we'd like to be able to pull that controller out while not breaking what we've already built, logically from our API perspective. We'd like to pull that out and we'd like to, run that in its own container or its own space and scale just, let's say, the inventory aspect of our API up to 10 instances and back down to 0 when we don't want it. So it makes perfect sense to transition that over to container apps and the API and separate it out to its own, container, rather than approaching from a perspective of, we've already got 50 containers that we use. How do we best, take advantage of this particular situation? It's very much, I find it very much coming from a programmer paradigm than, an infrastructure where or ops, where we've got a set of containers and we're looking for better ways to house them and, better ways to run them. and I'm not saying that you can't use container apps for any of that. Obviously you can, but it makes sense from a programming mindset to sort of approach it that way, as particularly if your application is building and getting larger. So a brief word on what DAPR is, and I've got sort of I've got DAPR in here. Now I've drawn this, relatively simply to start off with. We could just have one container app, call it front, and it's all self-contained, and we run it and away we go. Now, if we'd like to break up the functionality, maybe we've got, some events that come in, we've got some back-end pieces that we want to run, and just being able to have the capability and the freedom to be able to take some code, drop it in as another container app, and then, have a simple way of being able to talk to it. Because if you imagine we've got a container app and I've called it back, maybe we've got back 1, back 2, back 3, maybe we go up to 50, or maybe we've got a whole variety of different container apps that we want to talk to. One of the problems that I've found, particularly with clusters, container clusters and the like, is, well, how do we keep track of where they are, and in particular, how do we keep track of what port they're listening to, for example, and as a developer, how do I, I'm building a new back-end service, how do I know what's already in that cluster, and I don't want to clobber ports and things like that, particularly if, let's say, I'm building a container and I don't want to sort of reuse a port that's already been used by another team or group. Or what happens if I'm a business and I've asked some external remote developers to go and build some containers for me in container and or build some functionality and deliver to me in a suite of containers. Suddenly something so insignificant as what port are you listening on starts to become quite an important, significant piece when we're looking to run this. So, there's a fair amount of work, and if you've ever done, been exposed to it, there's a fair amount of work with, well, how do we do this? How do we set up some sort of service registry or internal DNS, or, and there are ways to solve it, obviously, but, it's yet another step that we need to consider. Now, in our world of DAPR, we've got a variety of different services that we can use, or tools in this toolkit that we can use. And one of them is this Invoke Service. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to call into, this other container app or this other piece of functionality, other code running. Doesn't need to be, same code. It could be Python and Ruby or Go or, Node or C# or whatever you'd like to do. That's, that's not up for debate here. But what I'd like to do is call into it. But as this particular front container app, I want to call into it, but I don't want to know the details of it. I suppose the microscopic details of that, in-depth details of that back-end service that I'm calling into. What I'd like to do is be able to say, well, when it's ready, please call this particular container. And so what I can do is use an industry standard and use this DAPR invoke methodology that just sort of says, I'd like to call a container back, and on that back container, I'd like to call the get orders method. Please go and call that for me, DAPR. And so there's a little bit involved in that, but what that invoke functionality gives us is resilience and redundancy, so that, let's say I don't make the call first off, it's down or it's busy or it's, that call can't come through. The DAPR invoke service allows me, some freedom there, that it will do some retries for me if it's missing or not able to call it. and various other things. And I'm also able then to deploy the back container service or application free, at my will, changing ports, changing various configurations about it, without the fear of having to break or breaking some of the other existing components that rely upon it. So it's quite handy, and there's a variety of other services that DAPR gives us. And I'm just going to sort of move on to this next slide here and just sort of talk to you a little bit about what some of these services are in the world of DAPR. So we've got this nature of Invoke, which kind of here's some DAPR functionality on some code. Now let me just bring in the pen. So if we take this piece of code that is talking to DAPR. Now, I should make mention, you don't need to go anywhere near container apps to use DAPR. You could use it in your own applications. So what we have here is what we call a DAPR instance alongside my code or my service or API or whatever it might be that's running. And I've also got I've got another, let's say, API that also has, or another module or piece of code or even solution project that is also running alongside DAPR as well. Now, as far as this Invoke is concerned, it's basically my code is saying, please, DAPR, can you go off and run this and return me back the results? Now that this is essentially saying, I'd like you to go and run an application which is called back, and I'd like you to call the get orders method on that. So that's kind of one aspect to this. There's a wide variety of other features that DAPR gives us, from things like state management to, there's even a pub sub model in there if you want to go down and start to work with some of these things. So DAPR is a set of tools or a toolkit that allows us to build quite intelligent and easy and rapid distributed applications. Now, in terms of what some of those services look like, the DAPR is known as a sidecar. So when we have an application, we'd say, hey, I'd like to enable DAPR. It runs as, let's say, a process on a port. And the very first HTTP call there is that, you reckon I can get that? No. This draw, there we go. The very first HTTP call just essentially says, go off and invoke a method on another service name that DAPR knows about. So it's really from my application that is running DAPR, or this is enabled, has DAPR enabled nearby. We have this. It's the default port is port 3500, and we're calling this Invoke Service. Now, the next piece of the puzzle here, back, is an application name that's known to DAPR. So if you think about that previous slide, when I go to sort of register my application with DAPR, I need to give it a name. And I say, well, here is the name of my application, might be called back, and the method that I'd like you to go and run on that application is called save state. So there's a little bit of knowledge known, but if you think about other things like the ports that it's on, where it's deployed, how it's deployed, the language that it's running in, all of these other things we don't need to know about. Now, in terms of some of the other services that we might be interested in, and that is the state service. Maybe we want to sort of save state somewhere around the place. Then, this is the name of the store, and then what is the key that we'd like to, in this case, retrieve the value of. So it could be a Redis cache, it could be Cosmos DB, it could be SQL, it could be Azure Storage. And in fact, DAPR is designed to work with a whole wide variety of different languages, different programming models, different clouds. It makes your solution quite portable. So we can talk to DAPR over HTTP or gRPC. If you're not familiar with gRPC, it is, my testing has been 400% faster than HTTP calls. So HTTP 3 is sort of playing catch up to gRPC, but there's a variety of other services that DAPR runs as well. All right. So just to let you know, so we don't, to reiterate, we don't need to have DAPR to make this work, but it makes it a lot easier. Now, in terms of creating some of the pieces that we'd like to have within our container apps environment, or working area, I've got some command line tools here for us, or command line snippets, where we might go off and create our environment. So we've got the first thing is we go and create our analytics, our environment up there, and whereabouts we would like our Azure apps, container apps environment. So remember, that's our logical grouping. It's also where our logging takes place at that level. And then underneath that, we would go and create one or more container apps. And I'll talk about what that is in a tick. So let me jump over to, all right, that will do. Okay. So I'm just going to show you what the container apps environment looks like. And so I've got a resource group. We're looking at Azure here in the portal. And I've got various bits and pieces. I don't need them all. I don't need, for example, App Insights, but it really gives me some great visibility into a bit of the demo that I want to show you. Container registry, ACR, user group Mick, my container. Now, container apps is only available in a few places. So Northern Europe, East US, and there's a few other places. So it's still in preview, and it's quite common practice for Microsoft to just roll it out gradually to the different regions and areas. So I've got my log analytics, and I've also got a file that has all of the various commands in there. So that are designed to set this environment up. So I've got two container apps, as you can see. One is my online store API, and then I've got my orders API, which the online store API goes and calls as part of its operation. So it's really just gone through I suppose the motion that I mentioned before, that everything used to be served out of this one API. However, we found that the orders API, or the orders controller, became quite big and was being hammered. So we decided to pull that piece of functionality out and run it in its own container app. Now, the feature, the online store feature one, often we like to spin up feature environments, testing out various bits and pieces. At the moment, it's still, this is still preview, so expect a lot of this functionality that you see in front of you to start to, really become richer. Now I've got, various bits and pieces. I've got apps that are deployed into this environment here that you can see. I've got latest revisions of those which are coming out of the which are assigned by the Azure Container Apps service, and these are the names that I've given to them, and that's them in the resource group. So not too much really to look at from this perspective, but if I have a look at the resource JSON, for example, that makes this stuff up, I can start to see things like my static IP address, and also that base level domain that I mentioned before that is given to me by Microsoft. And we can start to see some of the other bits and pieces around the configuration, some of the properties, what the log analytics is, and the region and so on. So look, we get a little bit of info in there. Starts to become quite interesting shortly. So if I then start to have a look, for example, at the logging aspect, my workspace, my log workspace here, I'm just going to have a look down at some logs, and I should, there it is. It's going to get rid of that little pop-up screen. Now, one of the things that it gives us is this container, the console, a custom log here, our container apps console log. Now, I'm just going off and running this particular query, and maybe I'll do it just for the last, let's say the last 4 hours. What I'm getting here is my standard out from my, don't really see too, we see a little bit here. My standard out from my containers as they're running. And, standard out, standard error, for example, as well. And maybe what I might want to do is, if I can type tonight, I might want to just look at that in reverse order and sort of, see what's here. Now, there it is there. I also might want to, and I can play around with this till my heart's content. I might want to look at, what the log is. And do I have a server? I'll do server another way, sorry. And what the revision is. So, what it is, it's actually emitting that log. And so I've now got, what the log is in here, some details. So it's just like my container app running. There's a whole bunch of other things that's going on here as well. And we can start to see what that revision name is in there as well. So, we can, let's see, yeah. So we can bring that out, and then that's the revision that's actually been running in here. So maybe, I'm starting to get some interesting information. I've got some IP addresses, bits and pieces in there as well, and other bits and pieces. So I'll leave the logging for a moment, but you can start to see, even as I deploy these containers in, it becomes, quite intuitive around, what is the information that's being spat out as well. So here I've got, my environment. It's a great place to start, looking good. And let me just go back to here for a moment. So really what we've done is just the top part of this and spun up that environment. So I do need a log workspace, and that's pretty much it, and a location where my environment is gonna live. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, we've got a client. I've got a container apps environment here. Once again, I don't need DAPR on any of this stuff. However, it makes it easier to talk to these backend services or the other containers that exist in this environment. Also, things like there's some logging and metrics and those sorts of things that exist over the top of when we make these calls over Invoke and things like that. So it's really you get a lot of bang for your buck here for sure. All right, so let me go back to here for a moment. Let's start to jump into some code. Oh, really? Let me just move that over. You can move over. Somehow, I said manually move that over to the, there we go, to the sharing screen. All right. So it could be done in Visual Studio Code, could be done, wherever you like. So I've got two projects here. One is, and they're just minimal APIs from a, Visual Studio project, really not much in them at all. Pretty similar across each of these different projects. Now, one of the things that I did, so I've come along, and I don't need to. So DAPR, for example, does come with HTTP SDK or your HTTP APIs. So I could make a whole bunch of HTTP calls to DAPR if I wanted to. However, just to make life a little bit easier, I decided to go and use this DAPR client. And that's really just where that comes from. So I've added some app insights in here. There's also some Swagger. Now, what I've also done is that's a little bit of a trap for young players here, and that is that when I, if you don't sort of touch anything and I wanted to deploy it as easily as possible, then it deploys the release version. So these, your Swagger endpoints and UI and things don't come across in release because of the development. So I've just taken that out. I've also just included a little bit around DAPR here, around what an API might be, what that URL might be. Now I'd go and read that port from an environment variable, but just in the interest of simplicity and time, I haven't. I've also then, this is a minimal API, so I've just got something that answers the root hello and just stuck an environment variable in there. And then I've also gone off and just said, well, get me whatever the environment variables are that are part of this deployment wherever I'm running. Now, with the invoke method, there's another method here. With this invoke, so /order, for example, it's part of the DAPR setup and the DAPR client, and I've just kept it. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the. Oh, that'll do. Get IntelliSense up for us. So here I've got, as part of this, it's an async call, but it's just saying, go off to this app ID and go and call this method. So part of the SDK makes it quite easy for me to go and make these calls. Somewhere or other in my store API, my online store API, I need to know that this has been registered with the backend, the backend container, or the other containers have been registered with the with DAPR under that particular name. And then somewhere or other, there is a get order API that's there. So if I go into the order API here, for example, I do have a post, and it's get order, and it's just going to return a list back of 1, 2, 3 that, in effect, we've actually made the call. I don't have, anything else. I don't have any sort of I am this to DAPR or anything like that. I've kept the integration with DAPR simple. I could go a lot further, but I haven't. And that's sort of as far as what I want to do. That's it there. I could formulate an HTTP, sort of where I've got /state. It could be invoke. It could be the application name. So I could do it via just straight HTTP or an HTTP client without the need to have, the DAPR client here at all. But that's not what I'm really kind of wanting to show. So the piece that I've done here is to go and do a publish, and I'm publishing to an Azure Container Registry. I could go and, let's say, publish directly into here in Visual Studio. I could go and publish directly into Azure Container Apps. So I do want to publish directly into the container registry. So I'm just creating a container, and I've got an image somewhere. So let's go and look at that container registry now for the moment. And here it is here. One of the things that I do need to do, and I'm going to blow this away, so that's fine. One of the things that I do need to do is to have a username and password, because it just makes it easier when we're deploying a container to be able to allow Azure Container Services or to Container App Services just to pull the image down from the repository. So I've got two repositories here, one for my store API and the other for my for my orders API. And I've just got it stored under the tag of latest, just so that I don't want to have to get into tag management and those sorts of things. So it's a pretty simple store. Now what I'm going to do is to bring over the, all right, let's go here. And what I'm going to do is, so I've got that Azure create, the create command at the ready, which I might kind of bring to there, and I'm just going to do that. There we go. So if we go back to our feature environment and have a look at the apps here for the moment, I've got my online store API, which in effect is the front door. And I've also got, that other container app. So I've got a container that lives in, and I'm just going to get the right one. Okay, that'll do. I've got a container app that lives in sorry, I've got a container. Sorry, my puppy is just like all going banana here beside me. All right, so what this line of code does, and I'll go through it, it goes off and creates. So it says for an Azure, go and create a container app. Now, is this container app going to be externally accessible or just internally? And for this particular case, because it's the front door, I'm going to make it externally available. Now, what port is my container app listening on? And my container listening on. And just because out of Visual Studio, I didn't touch anything. Typically, it's port 80 internally. I could set that to 3000. I could set it to 8082, whatever that might be. But just for the moment, I've set it to port 80. Now, I've also got what are my CPU requirements for my particular container, and how much memory should we give it. Also, when we're looking at scale, what's the minimum and maximum replicas that I should have? What is the name of this container app, which is this OS API? The resource group, which is that resource group, user group, container apps demo. And what is the image that I'd like to bring down, which is from the image name is this, which I'll just point you off to so we can see it. That's the image name there. So it's got the name of the container repository in it and the image itself, and then what version or what tag we'd like to use. So that's the image name. Now, what's the container apps environment? I do a query on this just to say, please give me the fully qualified domain name at the end of this. And I've also got enable DAPR. So as part of my command line, I can enable DAPR and I can give my application an ID on this. Now, there's some other parameters that I can do, but that makes sense. So what I'm going to do is because I'm making some changes, I'm just going to delete this particular container app just so you can see it in action. And this is the front door, if you like. So I'm just going to delete the front door of this particular this container app. Now that it's pretty quick, given that, probably I might be one of the only ones on it. No, but should go pretty quickly. There we go. All right. So I'm now going to run this command, and I'm just going to make sure I've got it all okay. Now there's a bunch of other DAPR type configuration options. But you can start to see a few things in there. What I haven't done are any of the scaling rules in here, and I can come back and update the image. So I've hit enter now on this, and it's going to go away, and it should run things. Now I can add a debug command to that line and get a lot more information out, but I haven't. So that's now provisioned that particular container app from my service. From my repository, let me now go and jump into here. So that there is my line, just to show you where that's from. That there is the get. So it's a good idea just to have a get on the root, just so that by default, minimal APIs don't have them. So you sit there wondering about all this stuff, and it comes back and going, not found, not found. And maybe there's something up with the ports, maybe, some sort of from your container to the outside world. So then this is my store API that's running. What I'd like to do here is to, now go and have a look at the environment variables, and you can start to see that there's some DAPR variables that have been put in here, such as the HTTP port, and there's also some underlying Kubernetes information that's been put in here as well. So it's quite interesting, quite fascinating as to what we're doing. So obviously the simple piece, we go off and we execute an API that's just on our front end, and there's our our weather coming back. Now I haven't configured DAPR to have a state store, so that won't work at the moment. And I've also just and when I upload these demos and things, I'll correct this, but I want this to go off and call the other container app that's running, and I just haven't got that set up just yet. So I'm almost there with the Invoke. Oh, there we go. Sorry, it did work. Sorry. Nothing like the redeployment. I'm happy about that. So that piece there is pretty significant in the sense that what it did, I surprise myself sometimes. What it did was go and run this. I just sort of said, go and run an application called Orders API and go and get, run this method on there called get order. So if you think about what we've done, I've broken up our other functionality into this minimal API. It doesn't have to be minimal, but I just didn't want to have a whole bunch of scaffolding code to sort of go through. And there's this API that's running. Now, it's doing its own thing in its own container, as is this. And there's nothing stopping us from deploying multiple images, if you like, into the one container as well. But what I've done at the moment is a 1-for-1. And so this is running somewhere else within our Container Apps environment. This is also running. And so I've told it to go off. So somewhere or other, DAPR must know that this particular orders API equates to this container here. And I'll just show you that little bit of magic. And look, there's a lot, there's a lot we can go into on this. But if I go back to one of my other creates, oh, by the way, if I update my image, for example, here's a way that I can go and update my container app and then just go and update the image that way. So it's quite an interesting, quite an interesting way to do things. Now, all of this could be, for example, in a pipeline in GitHub Actions, for example, so that when you check your code in and it gets built and compiled down a pipeline, you could go off and deploy and it'll go and automatically update your container apps that are running. Now, let me show you this one. That's the one I want to show you. So this one is for the orders API that, once again, I've gone and created a container app. Now, in this case, it's internal. So there is no external address that needs to be assigned or allocated to this particular container app. It's also listening on port 80. So, you just work out whatever that port is in terms of the mapping. So inside the container, the port is port 80. I don't really care too much about the external, if you like, the outside port, or if we were in the world of Docker, the Docker port. Once again, what is the CPU and memory requirements? I've got minimum replicas being 0, maximum being 3. Now I've also given it the name Orders API. It doesn't need to. This is just purely, to do with container apps. And the image, I've just given a hard-coded address to that image, to that image address, the environment. Now the part where it becomes awesome is the part here where we go enable DAPR. So in other words, spin up a sidecar associated with this container. So add the DAPR service, if you like, in this container. The port, because if you think about DAPR needs to call my service, needs to call this API. So I'm telling DAPR the port that you can go and call this on is port 80. Now, we can also do things like gRPC and a whole bunch of other things as well. And the key behind this is this particular container is to be known to you, DAPR, as Orders API. So that's where that comes in line 44. Now, this container or this project, whatever we're calling, has to have a method of get order. So there is a little bit that we need to know about this other piece of functionality, if you think about from the caller, but that could be passed in through environment variables or through key vault, and the like. But what I don't need to know about is, well, whereabouts is this? What port is it listening on? And there's a raft of other DAPR functionality that I love, but I can't really go in. I don't have time to go into here. And this goes and sort of creates it. Now, I want to sort of create other components of DAPR here, and a state store and a Redis cache and, events and a whole bunch of other things. But that's kind of as easy as it is in our world. Now, what I'm going to do is to show you a couple of other bits and pieces. So that there went off and ran. If I, for example, run this outside of, and the problem is, right, when we haven't called it for a while, this is what that 0 does. It goes down to 0 and then sort of it's not running. So if you're familiar with the .NET world, you get there you go. It's now spinning up quite nicely and running quite nicely. So what I'm going to do is to maybe I'll take this environment call that we run for a moment. So I'm going to take that. I'm going to show you what scale looks like and how scale works. what I'm going to do is come over here, go to there. Where are you? And all right. So if what's a get? That'll do. Yep. If I send this, so they're my results. We expect that. So what I'd like to do now is to start to adjust scale, and you can start to appreciate that I can do this on any one of my container apps. So I've now got, my container apps, and as I mentioned, we can deploy multiple images, and these container apps will scale all those images en masse, if you like, together. So I've got this revision management. There's some details around, what my ingress looks like and other things. So I'm going to bring this up. Beautiful, it's here. And I'm going to create a new revision. So here's my new revision. Give it a name. So I'm going to just call it OS API 2. And let's configure some of the scaling rules. So I'm going to let it go up to let's say 6 instances. And I'm going to create a rule calling, let's say, we'll call it Bonanza. Oh, lowercase Bonanza, sorry. There we go. So once again, I can, and just to show you, the queue, but also the CADA pieces in here as well. So these are, let me just put in type. So we can start to, sorry, I don't have the info there at the moment, but we can add a whole bunch of different CADA events and the like in here, and what these things trigger and so on as well. So that's where that comes into it. I can also do it through my PowerShell script. Keep it simple for now. What I'm going to do is to say scale to the next instance once you get 2 or more concurrent requests. And I'm just going to leave that in there at the moment. And I'm going to hit create. So it says the new instance is being provisioned. And 100% of my traffic is going to this one. I don't know. I think I've got the there we go. So I've now got multiple revisions coming up. And, I could split this. I could split the load if I wanted to. I could still support my previous version. And it's purely just based on round robining. There's no sort of content-based inspection or routing or anything along those lines at the moment. So I've just waited for that revision to come up, for that new instance to come up, and I need to sort of hit it a little bit. So what I'm going to do is to bring Postman up and bring you side by side. So one of the ways that I found an easier, and believe you me, trying to figure this out in sort of how to show you when these servers spin up and the like. I could do it through logs, and I could look at the log analytics. I just had to have a little bit more set up. Now at the moment, I've got one instance running, or down here. So here's this is App Insights, and here's my servers that I've got, and I've got one instance running. Now what I'm going to do is to just hammer this. It tended to work a fair bit beforehand. I might have to go out to other windows, but it seemed to work when I tried this before, just before the demo. So I've gone and done this. Now you can start to see it started to scale out for me automatically. Don't worry, this one's the old revision. Don't worry about that guy. So I'm now up to 4 servers, and it's not the best, but it kind of works. So let's not sort of split hairs over how I make concurrent calls, but not really. It's sort of, the emperor's new clothes. Okay, so that's spun up. You can see they're not really doing much. I can see the memory being used. So these are my different container app revision instances running. And, I've got some great sort of app insight analytics. I've got, particularly around my calls as well, that I can, see in my application maps and things like that as well. I'm just going to keep that there for the moment. If I'm running that Invoke, of course, you asked me to log in right now. And so as we don't use these and the connections drop down. So think about if you're using HTTP 2 or the, connections are being maintained or kept alive, it might influence or play a bearing on these sort of numbers. So what I'm going to do is just close that down so the browser shuts it down as well. And we should start to see these drop off. Now, don't forget, these is, the polling here is 60 seconds. And, we can start to see my application map doing not much at all right now in App Insights, because I've made one call, but you can sort of see it being called off to 3,500. So that's quite interesting in there. And, there's a lot we can explore. But really, once I make those Invoke calls, they're durable, they're resilient. I also get some metrics around it as well, and some what they call observability around how those calls are operating. And I'm just, it's like watching paint dry a little bit here. But what do we got? We've got 5, and we should start to see these drop away as that. And I'm just going to shut those down as well, just to really drop all those connections. And giving it a moment. They should disappear.
Hey, Mick, we're at about an hour and 15 already.
All right. Yeah, no, we're done. We're done. As far as, look, I'm sorry, mate, I get carried away, but look, trust me, they will drop away. You saw some wonders, and that's sort of part and parcel of what we've got. So really, in terms of the wrap up, that was container apps. Really, starting to think about what's the best way to get some code taken out of your existing code base, if you like, your monolith. How can I run it? You don't need DAPR. However, it does make life a lot easier. So, once again, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I welcome all your questions.
Okay, let me just...
How was that, Bill? Quickest wrap up in history.
Very good. So I will add all of us back into there. Thank you very much, Mick. And it was really good to see, because I haven't seen much of either the container apps or DAPR. So that was good. And I think it's going to be an interesting decision on the container apps, a little bit around, because we've done some of the app services containers too.
Yes.
And if you really look under the covers to the Linux app services, they're actually running inside of a container, kind of under the covers for you.
Yes.
But yeah, the container apps do look good. So it's going to be interesting decisions to make for customers when they go and look at these things now.
Look, and I think, I've had a fair bit to do with running the Linux containers as app services. And as you're saying, under the covers, they do run as a container. And one of the things that I've noticed is that in production systems, in busy times, in terms of the logging and things, the things either running slow or we've scaled out to 20 instances. and there's just gaps in, well, what is it doing? Like, something comes in, it doesn't make sense why it's slow, or returning back for waiting for 4 minutes to get back. And then, there's a whole bunch of sort of network traffic and snap ports and, just network stuff that typically in the application space, you don't have visibility into. And, then running as a Windows instance, you do get visibility into that easily. So it's, you got to go digging, and it's tough.
Yep. So, and the other one that we ran into was App Insights doing sampling.
Oh, yes. look, when App Insights is doing sampling, you've made it. You've done well. We're now in production, guys.
Yep. So, okay. Thank you very much for that. That was good. And I'm sure over the next few months, we're probably going to want to dig a little deeper into some of those things with some of the container apps, because I know there's a lot of people that seem to be interested in those, especially if it takes out a lot of that plumbing and stuff that you have to do with AKS and things like that, and just makes it a whole lot easier to do.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And folks, I didn't put my details, but, if you do have questions and things, by all means, as you're rewatching this recording, shoot me a line and we can discuss, because often you tackle these things in phases.
Yeah, just drop me your details and I can add them to the description of the recording.
Awesome. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to end the broadcast now, and I will talk to you guys later.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Dan.
Cheers,
Thanks, everyone.